Hello, my name is Maria Matise, and I'm very happy to welcome you back to Family and Life Academy and to the sixth and final lesson of our course on abortion. The course has been presented by three teachers, Dr. Greg Pike, Anne Farmer, and John Smeaton. In the first lesson, Dr. Greg Pike presented data from some of the best scientific studies in recent decades that demonstrate the humanity of the unborn from conception. In the second lesson, John Smeaton explored the universal principles of natural and divine law to show why abortion is one of the greatest evils in history. In the third lesson, Anne Farmer delved into eugenics and its relation to legalized abortion. In the fourth lesson, John Smeaton unwrapped the main tactics in the worldwide abortion revolution. And in the fifth lesson, Greg Pike presented rigorous, peer-reviewed research into the physical and psychological impact of abortion on women. All previous lessons are available on the Family and Life Academy website for you to watch and re-watch any time. In this final lesson, John Smeaton examines how some of the leading figures, key events, and cultural forces that have shaped the battle on abortion. And at the end of the lesson, he will answer any questions you may have, which you can put in the chat window at any time during the lesson. John Smeaton has been active in the pro-life movement for over 50 years on both national and international level. He is a co-director of Voice of the Family, which has also launched this Family and Life Academy platform for online formation. And I will now hand over the stage to John, please.
Thank you, Maria. I begin with Our Lady's appearance in Fatima and her prophetic words to three shepherd children in 1917. Our Lady's prophecy provides the best possible lens through which we can see clearly some of the significant events and key figures in the history of legalized abortion over the past 100 years. Dr. Plinio Correa de Oliveira, the great Brazilian Catholic intellectual and historian, wrote that Our Lady's appearance in Fatima was the most important event of the 20th century. He said, from every standpoint, for the nature of their content and the dignity of the one who revealed them, the Fatima revelations surpass all of what Providence has said to mankind in the impending cataclysms of history. Our Lady's central message to the three children came in her appearance on 13th of July 1917. Having warned the children of the punishments to befall the world if men did not stop offending God, Our Lady said that in order to prevent these punishments, I shall come to the world to ask that Russia be consecrated to my Immaculate Heart, and I shall ask that on the first Saturday of every month, communions of reparation be made in atonement for the sins of the world. If my wishes are fulfilled, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, then Russia will spread her errors throughout the world. For over 100 years, Our Lady's wishes were not fulfilled, and Russia has indeed spread her errors throughout the world. It's important to note that an inherent part of the political and social revolution in Russia in 1917 was a sexual revolution. Alexandra Kollontai was the first Soviet commissioner for social welfare, and Inessa Armand was a communist politician who had great influence with Lenin. Both fought publicly for free love and for the introduction of divorce and abortion in Russia. In 1920, in the second edition of the magazine Kommunistka, Alexandra Kollontai wrote, "In place of the individual and egoistic family, a great universal family of workers will develop in which all the workers, men and women, will above all be comrades. This is what relationships between men and women will be like in the communist society. These new relationships will ensure for humanity all the joys of a love unknown in the commercial capitalist society, of a love that is free and based on the true social equality of the partners. The red flag of the social revolution, which flies above Russia and is now being hoisted aloft in other countries of the world, proclaims the approach of the heaven on earth to which humanity has been aspiring for centuries. Unquote. The historian, Professor de Mattei, in an address to the Fourth Rome Life Forum, said that Alexandra Kollontai and Inessa Armand were convinced that sexual liberation was a necessary premise for the bringing about of a socialist society. And he said, on December 1917, a few weeks after the Bolsheviks rose to power, divorce was introduced, and in 1920, abortion was legalized. It was the first time that the procedure was available without restriction in the whole world. Prostitution and homosexuality were decriminalized in 1922. Russia's abortion law went on to inspire the campaigning of the pro-abortion lobby in other parts of the world. Simone de Beauvoir, the French philosopher and co-founder of the women's liberation movement in France, and first president of the pro-abortion organization Choisir, wrote that the Russian abortion laws had, and I quote, assured women's liberty in relation to the male. In Britain, Clinton Chance, a wealthy stockbroker who funded the inaugural meeting of the Abortion Law Reform Association, or ALRA for short, founded in 1936, he sent a letter of protest when hearing that the Russian abortion law was to be rescinded. Arnold Wilson, a Conservative member of Parliament and the Vice President of ALRA, which played a key role in the legalization of abortion in Britain, expressed his enthusiasm for countries, including Russia, which were, quote, sparing no effort to prevent the birth of the unfit by every method known to silence. And Dora Russell, a prominent supporter of ALRA and the wife of Bertrand Russell, the liberal philosopher, regarded the Russian abortion system as exemplary and tried to publicize it. In my last lesson, I spoke about the criminal case in 1938 precipitated by a London gynecologist, Alec Bourne, as an example of the tactics used by abortion campaigners in the worldwide abortion revolution. Alec Bourne features briefly in this lesson too, since the Alec Bourne criminal case was perhaps the key event in the history of the legalization of abortion in Britain, which in its turn went on to have an impact worldwide. And Alec Bourne was a member of ALRA, the Abortion Law Reform Association, the abortion campaigning body whose leading supporters were so inspired in their efforts by Russia's abortion regime. As I said in my last lesson, Alec Bourne set out to test the British laws in 1938 by performing an abortion on a 14-year-old girl who had apparently been raped by several soldiers. The Society for the Protection of Unborn Children explains, Alec Bourne gave himself up to police, was charged with an illegal abortion and pleaded not guilty on the basis that the girl's mental health would have been adversely affected by giving birth. Bourne was acquitted after the judge, Mr. Justice McNarton, advised the jury that if a doctor believed the continuation of the pregnancy would make a woman, quotes, a physical or mental wreck, unquotes, he was operating for the purpose, quote, of preserving the life of the mother, unquote. The jury acquitted him and the case was never appealed. The effect of the Alec Bourne case was to give legal sanction for abortions to prevent damage to a woman's physical or mental health a test which became interpreted more and more liberally and which was incorporated into the British Abortion Act in 1967. The influence of the judge's comments extended far afield to Commonwealth countries such as Australia. Anne Farmer, one of the teachers of this abortion course, in her book By Their Fruits, writes about the close association of the Abortion Law Reform Association, ALRA, with the Alec Bourne case. Their fingerprints were all over it. Alec Bourne himself was a member of ALRA. A few months before his criminal case, another member of ALRA, Dorothy Thurtle, had asked a government committee of inquiry into abortion what would be the position if a test case was brought under the present law. The doctor who brought the rape victim to him, Joan Mallison, was a member of ALRA, and she and Alec Bourne worked together to bring about the legal case. Alec Bourne's legal counsel, Gerald Thesiger, was also the legal counsel for ALRA. Lord Horder, medical patron of ALRA, gave evidence in Bourne's defence. The efforts of Alec Bourne and his fellow members of ALRA, an organisation whose leading supporters were so inspired by Russia's experience of legalised abortion, went on to have, in their turn, a significant impact on the campaign in the United States to legalise abortion. Bernard Nathanson, the doctor who once ran the largest abortion clinic in the world and one of the most prominent campaigners for abortion in the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s, says in his book Aborting America on page 47, Great Britain has had an abortion law reform association since 1936, but its membership was tiny. Despite this modest following, the organisation was largely responsible for the sweeping British reform law in the following year. Nathanson went on to comment, perhaps we could do as well in the USA. I will turn now to the Cultural Revolution of 1968 in the West. It's important to note how the political and social revolution in Russia in 1917, including the sexual revolution and legalization of abortion, which were an integral part of it, is historically linked to the cultural revolution in the Western world, forever symbolized by student rioting on the 29th of May 1968 in Parisian universities. Roberto de Mattei, in the address already mentioned, in a lecture, A History of Revolutions and Their Consequences for the Family, said, the most violent attack that the family has ever undergone in the West was with the Cultural Revolution of 1968. The 50th anniversary of the events in France and elsewhere gave rise to the publication of numerous books and news commentary worldwide. NPR World News, for example, reported on 29th of May 2018, on the 50th anniversary this month, magazines and exhibitions are devoted to it, and documentaries and conferences are analysing and reanalyzing it. May 1968, NPR World News said, encompassed a cultural revolution, even a sexual revolution before a political one. And in no other country did a student rebellion lead to a workers' revolt that nearly brought down a government, unquote. And the University of Notre Dame Press published a book in 2021 entitled Global 1968, in which historians, filmmakers, musicologists, literary scholars, and novelists contribute towards a study of the extent to which, quotes, the period that we associate with the year 1968 constituted a cultural revolution. Summary of the study states, Contributors demonstrate that the short and long-term effects of the Cultural Revolution of 1968 varied from country to country, but the period's defining legacy was a lasting shift in values, beliefs, lifestyles, and artistic sensibilities, unquote. The brutal aftermath of the 1968 Cultural Revolution and its lasting shift of values are familiar to virtually everyone alive today. To give just two examples. Firstly, on the 22nd of January 1973, the US Supreme Court announced its judgments in the cases of Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. Abortion was permitted in all 50 US states at all stages of pregnancy. According to the US pro-life group, National Right to Life Committee, since those judgments were handed down, 63,459,781 unborn children were murdered by abortion in the US alone. Secondly, in September 2021, in San Marino, a country in which 97% of the population professed the Catholic faith, 77.28% of the voters said yes to legalizing abortion up to birth. To those of us old enough to remember the moral outlook in the Western world in the era before 1968, such developments as we have seen in recent decades would have been absolutely unthinkable. How did such cultural change come about? In his address to the Rome Life Forum already mentioned, Professor Roberto de Mattei explained how the concept of cultural revolution was explored and disseminated by intellectuals in Russia and in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, and how, step by step, that led to the revolution of 1968, which, in the words of Professor de Mattei, transformed the everyday life of Western society. Let's look at some of these main steps identified by de Mattei, which link the Russian political and sexual revolution in 1917 and the Cultural Revolution of 1968, a political and social revolution which has resulted in a sexual and abortion revolution worldwide. In 1922, a meeting was held at the Marx Engels Institute of Moscow to examine the concept of cultural revolution. The Marx Engels Institute of Moscow was linked to the Institute of Sexology in Berlin, which had been founded in 1919 with the goal of normalizing homosexuality. And in 1921, the founder of the Institute of Sexology had organized the first Congress for Sexual Reform, which led to the World League for Sexual Reform, a league for coordinating knowledge about the enhancement of sexual activity. The director of the Moscow Institute for Sexual Hygiene led a Soviet delegation to the World League for Sexual Freedom's first conference. In 1923, Felix Weil, a German-Argentine Marxist, financed the first Marxist work week in the German town of Limmenau. The success of this event led him to found the Institute for Social Research known as the Frankfurt Institute, which collaborated with the aforementioned Marx Engels Institute of Moscow. In 1929, Soviet political leaders invited a student of Freud, the Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, for a series of conferences which led to the publication of his paper Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis in Moscow, which constitutes the founding text of so-called Freudo-Marxism. In this, as well as in his later works, Reich presented the family as the repressive social institution par excellence and affirmed that the nucleus of happiness is sexuality. For him, the abolition of the family and the revolution from sex negation to sex affirmation were necessary. Wilhelm Reich's ideas in the West, combined with those of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, to establish what is known as the Frankfurt School, the name given to the social theory associated with the Institute. Representatives of the Frankfurt School were able to occupy key places in important American universities like Harvard, Berkeley, and San Diego. In 1955, one of the Frankfurt Institute's scholars, Herbert Marcuse, published Eros and Civilization, and in 1964, One-Dimensional Man. These books, like the ideas of Wilhelm Reich, reduced human nature to free yielding to sexual impulses. The books of Herbert Marcuse were huge bestsellers. According to Dissent magazine, in less than 5 years, over 100,000 copies of the book would be sold in the United States alone, with translations extending the influence of Herbert Marcuse into 16 foreign languages. Herbert Marcuse was a major intellectual influence on the New Left and student movements of the 1960s. At the University of Rome, students brandished placards proclaiming their allegiance to Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. And David Cohn-Bendit, the unofficial leader of the French Revolt of 1968, said in 2008, commenting on the events of the 1960s, "We read too much Marcuse." We now need to explore significant events which help to explain why the murderous tyranny of legalized abortion, claiming more lives in the past 100 years than all the wars in recorded human history, met with so little effective resistance. According to Roberto de Mattei, quotes, "One force alone could have stopped this process of moral dissolution: the Catholic Church." The summary of the book, Global 68, which I mentioned a few moments ago, notes that the defining legacy of the 1968 Cultural Revolution was a lasting shift in values and beliefs. This lasting shift in values and beliefs is perhaps most strikingly obvious in historically Catholic countries, including Italy, Spain, France, and the Republic of San Marino, which I mentioned earlier. Another example is the Republic of Ireland, where 84.2% of Irish people describe themselves as Catholic in the 2011 consensus. In a referendum on the 7th of September 1983, the efforts of ordinary Irish citizens resulted in the 8th Amendment of the Irish Constitution, which was signed into law a month later. It famously declared, "The state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn, and with due regard to the equal right to life of the mother, guarantees in its laws to respect and, as far as practicable, by its laws to defend and vindicate that right." 66.4% of Irish citizens who participated in the referendum voted to defend babies' lives before birth without exception. Phyllis Bowman, my predecessor as CEO of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, was a key figure and leading voice calling for the referendum and arguing for a yes vote. It proved to be a brilliant counter-revolutionary move which saved the lives of over 100,000 babies. Following the 1983 referendum, the bishops remained overwhelmingly silent on abortion, whilst the pro-abortion lobby worked hard in encouraging Irish women to travel to Britain for abortions. Blatantly unrepentant pro-abortion politicians in Ireland were permitted by bishops to receive our Lord Jesus Christ in Holy Communion. And in 1992 and 2002, disastrous statements from Catholic bishops encouraged Irish citizens to vote yes in referendums seeking to permit abortion in particular circumstances. By the grace of God, a majority of Irish citizens rejected the bishop's advice on those occasions. In 2018, however, 2/3 of Irish citizens voted in favour of repealing the Eighth Amendment. 35 years of lack of formation of Catholic consciences on the part of the Irish bishops had done its damage and resulted in yet another abortion referendum, which reversed the 1983 decision. On the 25th of May 2018, unborn Irish children were stripped of their dignity and protections by a huge majority of the adult voting population, with 66.9% in favour of killing the unborn and only 33.1% against, almost exactly the reverse of the result 35 years earlier. Why did the Catholic bishops remain overwhelmingly silent on the evil of abortion, even to the point of accepting abortion in particular circumstances in those earlier referendums? Silence was also the policy adopted by Cardinal Heenan, the Archbishop of Westminster, between 1963 and 1975, who was Catholic Primate of England and Wales at the time of the passage of the British Abortion Act. Cardinal Heenan told a group of medical students that it would probably be best as Catholics not to make too much of a fuss, and that anyway we shouldn't worry too much. The doctors won't let it happen. The question of the silence of priests, bishops, cardinals, not just in Ireland, but in every country in the world, has been on the lips of pro-life activists everywhere I've travelled in the world for the past 50 years in my work for the pro-life movement. And rightly so. Why the silence of the Catholic bishops? Roberto de Mattei writes, between 1962 and 1965, the Catholic Church knew its own revolution. It was the Second Vatican Council. Events and key world figures can prove to be historic because of decisive, timely action which is taken to address an evil threatening humanity. For example, few would doubt the opinion of the Times columnist Jawad Iqbal that Winston Churchill, whilst always a controversial figure both in his lifetime and after his death, led the resistance to Nazism and the threat it posed to Britain and Europe. Churchill's decisive action changed history. On the other hand, events and key figures can prove to be historic because of a failure to take decisive, timely action to address an evil threatening humanity. An example of this is the decision made by Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul VI not to refer to or condemn communism in the documents of the Second Vatican Council. Prior to the Council, the Vatican had been absolutely determined in its denunciations of communism. The American historian Frank J. Copper, writing in the Cold War History series, pointed out that, and I quote, before the Western Allies recognized the threat of Soviet expansion, before Churchill's Iron Curtain speech 1946, the Truman Doctrine 1947, and NATO 1949, the Roman Catholic Church had struggled against communism, which it perceived as an assault upon its doctrine, institutions, and community. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, the Holy See feared both the militant atheism of the Soviet state and its subversion of the social and political orders. Frank J. Copper continues, almost immediately, the Vatican perceived the ideology and its adherents as a peril to Christian civilization. These fears were revealed in the apparitions of Fatima of 1917, where Mary invoked prayers for the conversion of Russia. They were catalogued in Pius XI's 1937 encyclical Divini Redemptoris, and his successor, Pope Pius XII, mobilized Catholic forces to combat communism, initiating a global campaign against Bolshevism in general and the Soviet Union in particular. End of quote from Frank J. Copper. In an article for Catholic World Report on the 10th of December 2012, Edward Pentin, correspondent for the National Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register, wrote, and I quote, "As the Church celebrates the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, there is one lesser known and some would argue highly disturbing aspect of the Council that has tended to be overlooked: the absence of any reference to or condemnation of communism in the Council's document, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was at that time at the height of its powers." Edward Pentin goes on to cite from the 2010 autobiography of Cardinal Giacomo Biffi, former Archbishop of Bologna, Memoirs and Digressions of an Italian Cardinal. Cardinal Biffi wrote, "Communism was the most imposing, most lasting, most overpowering historical phenomenon of the 20th century, and yet the Council, which contained a decree on the Church in the contemporary world, doesn't talk about it." According to Roberto de Mattei, again author of the Second Vatican Council, An Unwritten Story, if the Second Vatican Council would have condemned communism, it would have helped accelerate its decline. The opposite occurred. The Vatican's Ostpolitik prolonged the survival of true socialism in the East Bloc countries by 20 years by providing a foothold for communist regimes in crisis. End of quote from Roberto de Mattei. The Vatican's policy of silence at the Second Vatican Council on one of the greatest evils afflicting humanity augured badly for the Catholic witness in the latter decades of the 20th century. The abandonment of the Church's teaching mission is seen in another aspect of the Second Vatican Council, which I explored earlier in this course in my lesson entitled The Evil of Abortion and How to Defeat It. I refer you to the study notes for that lesson for a full explanation of the problem. Very briefly, let me summarize. An influential group of well-organized bishops persuaded the Council Fathers and Pope John XXIII to reject the traditional presentation of Catholic teaching on a whole range of issues on the basis that it was too traditional, including the teaching on marriage. A new erroneous presentation on Catholic teaching from the Council reversed the ends of marriage and sent out the message that Christian marriage is primarily about mutual love between husband and wife. By making children secondary to marriage, children can then be seen as threatening the happiness of a couple or as a burden rather than a blessing. If children are perceived as a burden, it's a small step to accepting contraception as a way of avoiding children, and then it's a small step to accepting that babies can be avoided through abortion. The overwhelming majority of priests and bishops have offered no resistance to this. They are no longer presenting the true teaching of the Church, and for the most part, they have remained completely silent. During the past few years, the situation has appeared to get even worse at the highest levels of the Church. In my lesson on the tactics used in the abortion revolution, I referred to the message of Pope Francis in September 2016 for the celebration of the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation, in which he said that he was gratified that the nations of the world in 2015 had endorsed the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These goals included calling on nation states to provide universal access to abortion on demand, access to legal abortion throughout childbearing years, including for young people from ages 10 to 19. For 3 decades prior to Pope Francis's message, the Holy See had been fighting at the United Nations against this very proposal. Indeed, the American Time magazine, which sells all over the world, made Pope John Paul II its Man of the Year in 1994 for his leadership in defeating a US-backed proposal calling for a right to abortion at the UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. In naming John Paul II its Man of the Year for 1994, Time magazine said, "His power rests in the word, not the sword. He is an army of one, and his empire is both as ethereal and as ubiquitous as the soul." In 1994, in response to a dramatic appeal from John Paul II, I joined hundreds of other pro-life leaders, academics, politicians and activists from around the world at the UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo to work to defeat this proposal. Pope Francis has apparently reversed Pope John Paul II's position, and he has made numerous other interventions on abortion, many of them giving great scandal, including his defense in November 2022 of the appointment of a pro-abortion economist, Mariana Mazzucato, to the Pontifical Academy for Life, saying she would give a little more humanity to the academy. However, entirely unexpectedly, in the middle of this calamitous situation at the highest level of the church, there was a development which provides solid grounds for hope, because paradoxically, it was Pope Francis who on the 25th of March 2022 consecrated Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In light of the innumerable unorthodox statements of Pope Francis on fundamental moral issues, many would wonder whether the 2022 consecration of Russia is authentic. In response to such concerns, Roberto de Mattei, a leading critic of the Pope, wrote on the 30th of March 2022, "The use of the term solemnly in the text of the act of consecration confers particular importance on the act of the Holy Father, which was performed at St. Peter's during an austere penitential ceremony. Pope Francis carried out this act surrounded by cardinals, bishops, representatives of the diplomatic world, priests, men and women religious, and ordinary faithful. At that moment, all over the world, thousands of bishops and priests joined in the words of the consecration." Professor de Mattei added, "On the fact that the consecration corresponded to the requests made by Our Lady to the 3 little shepherds of Fatima, there is almost unanimous agreement." This act of consecration gives us hope that the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary will be hastened, bringing new graces to the world and to the pro-life struggle against abortion. Indeed, just 3 months later, in June 2022, later than the consecration, the US Supreme Court overturned their 1973 decision, which made abortion a constitutional right and which has cost the lives of over 63 million unborn children, as I was saying earlier. The American pro-life movement has achieved something which is magnificent to the point of being miraculous. Whilst Donald Trump's admirable appointment of 3 morally upright justices proved decisive in the historic triumph of the Supreme Court's decision announced in June 2022, it's principally the result of half a century of relentless work by the pro-life movement, entirely focused on their strategic objective of overturning the 1973 ruling, which fabricated a woman's right to abortion throughout the 9 months of pregnancy, and which has cost the lives of so many unborn children. Electing presidents who were committed to appointing pro-life justices was the top priority of every American pro-lifer I've met on the various occasions over the past 40 plus years I've visited the United States whilst working for the UK's Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. In their pursuit of this honourable objective, which is destined to save millions of human lives, ordinary pro-life citizens embarked on first-class educational programmes, intelligent, well-balanced lobbying, and peaceful and prayerful witness to the sanctity of human life. This latter quality has been in abundant evidence on the pavements outside abortion clinics, in the ranks and in the leadership of pro-life groups, as well as on the floor of the US Congress and Senate. And the achievement of the US pro-life movement is all the more remarkable because, purely humanly speaking, they did it on their own, albeit with the help of God and his Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Fatima, but without the support of the overwhelming majority of the hierarchy and officials of the Catholic Church, to which most of the worldwide pro-life movement belongs. At which point I must briefly sound a friendly and respectful warning. If Catholic officials continue to treat unborn children as second-class citizens, the murderous regime in the United States will ultimately get worse, despite the overturning of Roe v. Wade. As the USA's abortion battle moves from the Supreme Court to the 50 states and Washington, D.C., let the heartbreaking experience of the Republic of Ireland, to which I referred earlier in this lesson, provide us all with an instructive example. On the 24th of June, 2022, it seems that God intervened in the history of the world in the Supreme Court decision on abortion. US pro-lifers and pro-lifers everywhere must redirect the incomparable qualities they have demonstrated in helping to achieve this triumph and turn their attention to a new top strategic objective, persuading the Catholic bishops to use their unique apostolic power to get behind the pro-life fight. This must be done by one-to-one meetings, nationwide organisation, and above all, through prayer and sacrifices. May graces continue to pour out on the world following the papal act of consecration of Russia and the Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary on the 25th of March, 2022.
Thank you, John. I feel I should allow a pause to carry this ending. Thank you very much for this overview of events and figures which have shaped the battle over abortion so decisively. I'm sure it was eye-opening for many of our listeners. And they have sent questions. So if you are willing to answer some, I would start by this one. What should be the strategy to overturn laws permitting abortion on demand?
Well, it depends on the country, on the country's constitution, and on the political system in that country. In the United States, the Supreme Court authorized a constitutional right to abortion in two cases, Roe v. Wade in 1973 and Doe v. Bolton, and both judgments actually were released on the same day, 22nd of January 1973, when the United States has its March for Life. I mentioned in my talk that over the past nearly 50 years, it's been the top priority of every pro-life group in the United States to reverse this decision, Roe v. Wade. This reversal was achieved on the 24th of June 2022, as I've been saying, in a case before the Supreme Court called Dobbs v. Jackson. Now, this decision does not eliminate legalized abortion in the United States, far from it. But it was the first pragmatic and entirely ethical step, I would say, open to the pro-life movement, which had to be taken in the war against abortion. It was entirely ethical because the right to an abortion was removed, and no right to abortion was conferred by the Supreme Court decision. And now, of course, abortion law is in the hands of each of the 50 states and Washington, D.C., as well as in the hands of the US Congress. Now, I understand that 26 US states are likely to seek to restrict abortion. Now, in Britain, the law was changed through parliamentary legislation in 1967, the Abortion Act 1967, which has led to virtual abortion on demand. So, again, going back very much to the wording of the question, it's legitimate and almost certainly necessary to take a step-by-step pragmatic approach to banning abortion. For example, in Britain, campaigning for legislation to ban public funding for abortion. Such an approach would be ethical, providing that nothing in the proposed legislation authorized direct abortions in particular circumstances. So, going back to the United States, it is clearly at a major turning point politically, not least in individual states which currently have very permissive abortion laws on abortion. I understand, for example, that in the state of Virginia, the governor there, he describes himself as a pro-life governor. He's backing legislation that would restrict abortion after 15 weeks, and making exceptions for the cases of rape, incest, and when the mother's life is at risk. Now, this just makes no sense morally. If infanticide were permissible in the state of Virginia, it would make no sense, and it would be wrong for anti-infanticide campaigners to fight for legislation expressly permitting infanticide in particular circumstances. You know, I often think and reflect on the fact that the only thing which really protects society's weakest, most vulnerable human beings are moral absolutes. Once legislatures accept that it's okay directly to kill an innocent child in the womb, the defense against killing any unborn child is taken away. And so, sorry, this is a bit of a sort of plea on my part. After a long time in the movement, I think the time has come for the pro-life movement worldwide, in my opinion, to campaign vigorously and openly for the complete abolition of direct abortion. The pro-life movement's job is to make the idea of stopping abortion completely normal, because it really is normal not to kill children. But I stress, a campaign to vigorously campaign to abolish abortion doesn't preclude supporting measures which in an ethical way seek to limit the harm of abortion legislation. However, an unequivocal, fully public abolition policy seeking to re-establish total legal protection for unborn children from all direct abortion is absolutely vital in persuading the public and ultimately politicians and intellectuals and judges, you name it, people of influence in society, that life truly is sacred from conception until natural death. Societies around the world have not been convinced, in my opinion, about the wrongness of all direct abortion, partly because, for the most part, pro-life groups have not consistently and publicly argued in support of that position. Most people, including Catholics, whose faith is entirely opposed to all direct abortion, will now accept abortion in certain circumstances. So, sorry to go on a bit, but I do think that pro-life groups have a duty of leadership in this matter. Other groups will follow their lead. Bishops, priests, and cardinals of the Catholic Church will follow their lead. Our policy will begin by meeting ridicule and incredulity. However, I think that within a few years, it will be seen to be the norm and the only logical, correct position for the pro-life movement to take. Sorry, but just one final thing. Does our opposition, when they're campaigning for same-sex marriage or do they mince their words? They certainly don't. And they achieve what they set out to achieve because they persuade people. So, anyway.
Thank you. So quite clear.
Thank you.
Thank you. So what would you say to people who don't remember the attitudes just a few decades ago, as you described, and who think of abortion as inevitable, even if they don't agree with it personally, but just they don't know any other reality?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that the abolition of the slave trade is always a good place to start. William Wilberforce, the great British Member of Parliament, he devoted his political life in the House of Commons in Westminster to the abolition of the slave trade. And he suffered many setbacks in Parliament and in Britain generally, because people thought that the slave trade was inevitable. Slavery was inevitable. I've actually just been reading a book, Culture and Abortion, by the American scholar and author Edward Short. And he does describe William Wilberforce's battle in that book. I recommend that book, by the way, Culture and Abortion by Edward Short. He makes the point from the standpoint of the 21st century, it might seem inevitable to us that the slave trade was so inhuman, it was certain to be abolished. But it wouldn't have looked like that in the late 18th century, when Parliament, it actually voted not even to debate the issue, but to refer the matter to colonial legislatures who had no interest at all in abolishing the slave trade. And I mean, the other big point is that it was Wilberforce's strong faith in God which made him absolutely convinced that the truth would prevail. So I would say then, in summary, when we encounter people of the kind mentioned in the question you put, they think abortion is inevitable, we have to draw a deep breath, say a prayer to the Holy Spirit and Our Lady, and give witness to the truth, beginning, as I say, with perhaps a reference to the slave trade and how its acceptance dominated British society in the late 18th century. You could refer, for example, to I think it was the Zong massacre in 1781. A slave ship was blown off course, and they'd run out of water for the slaves on board. Over 400 slaves on board this ship. So the captain and his crew threw overboard over 130 sick and dying slaves. And when they got back to port, the ship's owners claimed insurance money for the lost African slaves. And the issue went to court, where it was found that in certain circumstances, the murder of African slaves was lawful, and that insurers might have to pay for those who died. And the jury found in favour of the slave owners, albeit on appeal, the ruling came down against slave owners in respect of the insurance claim. However, there were unsuccessful attempts to have the ship's crew prosecuted for murder. Unsuccessful. Ultimately, I have to say, because of the publicity surrounding the court cases, the massacre did help the abolitionists, and modest changes were achieved. And actually, this example can help us. I suppose that's what I'm saying, by referring to a truly shocking incident like that in the history. It gives people a jolt and maybe makes them realise that whereas making the killing of unborn children illegal might seem impossible now, historians and ordinary people in time to come will judge the massacre that's happening now very differently, and will scarcely believe that it was tolerated.
Yes, thank you. Very instructive indeed. We have a couple of more minutes. I will take one more question, and that is a difficult question. How can we encourage bishops to support the pro-life movement when the Pope is doing the opposite?
Oh, okay. Well, I asked for it. I suppose I did talk about what the Pope has done with the Sustainable Development Goals, and how they call for the legalization of abortion all over the world, and he commended the acceptance of that by the nations of the world. And he's done other things. Well, he just in recent times, November November 2022, a pro-abortion economist was appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life, and Pope Francis defended the decision on the grounds that it gave the Academy humanity. So, how can we encourage bishops and others to support the pro-life movement? Well, I would say principally through constant prayer and daily sacrifices for our bishops, and fulfilling Our Lady's requests, the first Saturday communions of reparation, which came up in my lesson, and certainly other spiritual practices with regard to the first Saturday, in order to hasten the triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. I think we've already seen consequences of what happened in Rome earlier this month. So we really must be encouraged to do that more. I mean, I'm absolutely serious on that. But I did say also during the lesson that the US pro-life movement and the pro-life movement all over the world need to use the resources, skills, and dedication which were deployed in the battle for the appointment of good judges to the Supreme Court, who were going to decide on the constitutional right to abortion. They need to use those bishops. They need to use those same resources to encourage bishops to understand their prophetic role in the worldwide war against human life and the family. Now, I have my own ideas how that can be done, but in a way that's irrelevant. Others will have ideas. What's important above all is that everyone in the pro-life movement understands that it's their top priority, that it's actually our responsibility as lay Catholics to encourage bishops to fulfill the role given to them by Christ, to teach all nations and to preach the word in season and out of season. So really what I'm saying, this is primarily a strategic issue on a supernatural level. How it's actually done on a practical level is another matter. It has, a strategic decision of that kind has practical consequences in how we carry out our pro-life work on a daily basis. And everyone needs to start talking about that to each other. And within pro-life groups, how best to go about encouraging bishops. But above all, it is a supernatural matter. That's the sort of perspective we need to nurture. And to do that, as I say, we primarily need to pray and offer sacrifices and fulfill Our Lady's requests at Fatima.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. I think we must leave it here. And thank you everyone for participating in this course. The video of this lesson will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website with all the others, along with study notes and other resources. And of course, you can rewatch any of the lessons at any time in the future. If you have appreciated this course, then do please let other people know about it and look out for our other courses, which are currently available or coming up shortly. And now it remains for me once again to thank you so much, John, for putting this course together for the Family and Life Academy. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Maria.